the recording, I'd like to officially welcome everyone to the Misophonia Professional and Academic Collaboration Workshop number 3. I'd like to introduce Chris Pearson. Chris is going to be presenting on Sequent Repatterning hypnotherapy and effective treatment for misophonia. And Chris is a accredited senior hypnotherapist, proficient in NLP and parts therapy and timeline therapy. And in fact, I'll let you briefly tell your story as to how you got involved in misophonia. Maybe that's part of your presentation, so I won't go into that. But Chris and I met up, was that at the end of 2014, I think, that was looking up. I actually saw one of Chris's videos on YouTube and sent him an email because he was looking at some of the components of misophonia that I was interested in. And we have a great working relationship. So, Chris, I'm going to turn the presentation over to you now.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay just before
Yeah, you're great. Your audio is terrific.
Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm Chris Pearson, as introduced by Tom. And really this presentation is to introduce a feasible treatment for misophonia, and that's Sequent Repatterning. And it will include, first of all, a brief introduction to me, and then a quick view of the model of misophonia that I recognise. Now we can then review what constitutes the condition and the aspects of the condition that we can move on to treat. That in turn can inform our approach to therapy, I think. So from there we can take a look at Sequent Repatterning, which is the name that we've given to this group of interventions, just looking at the concepts and the structure rather than the detail of each therapeutic intervention. And then we can review its effectiveness, and to do that I'm going to introduce some basic data on cases that were begun and completed during 2015, their outcomes in fact. So being that these occurred during 2015, we've been able to take some medium-term feedback from the clients who were treated during that time. And then finally, I'd like to look forward with a few slides on our future plans. Now, I think as Tom has said, the plan is to complete this presentation to allow about 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end. So as I endeavour to make this work, as I've said, I am Chris Pearson. There's a picture of me if you can't see my video. I have a practice within the John Cox Health and Physiotherapy practice, which is in Yorkshire in the northeast of England. Quite obviously misophonia is being treated internationally now. I began my day 13 hours ago with a session with someone in Canberra in Australia, and during the day I've gradually covered most of the world, I think, ending at about 2 hours ago in the USA. I've had therapy rooms here in Yorkshire for almost 7 years now. It's over 5 years since I first encountered misophonia in a client, and I guess this is probably the 4th year of applying the techniques that make Sequent Repatterning. I first came across misophonia when someone came to me and told me that they had to wear earplugs while they were eating their meals with their partner. I confess I didn't really know what it was that was wrong with them. I did my best. Since then, working as a supervisor of other therapists in this part of the world, I came across other therapists who had also encountered individuals with what we now know to be misophonia. And so it very soon became clear that we needed to develop some kind of therapy that was effective. And as Tom said, we came across one another probably just over 2 years ago now, but since then we've been able to develop a close working relationship and also help, I think, a number of individuals. And in that time, I've seen, and I hope I've helped, men, women and boys and girls with misophonia in about 150 cases now, as well as introducing 3 other therapists to these techniques, and they all now have cases of their own. I'd like to say that I think of myself as a scientist. I began my life as a clinical biochemist, and although that was a long time ago, I do appreciate scientific rigour, and I hope that my therapies reflect that. So I must begin by saying clearly that my appreciation of the condition called misophonia is not one of selective sound sensitivity. I don't consider it to be purely a disorder of the auditory physiology. I've become increasingly aware, working with individuals with misophonia, that what elicits a misophonia response is quite definitely a sensory experience. And it may be predominantly in the auditory domain, but certainly not exclusively. And I've seen clients with a mixture of auditory and visual. I've treated one client who had exclusively a kinesthetic condition. So I think it needs to be emphasised that we are dealing with something which is multisensory. Also, I consider the initiating sensory event to be an experience, and certainly with clients I avoid the use of the word trigger, because I think that trigger implies an inevitability that is not absolute in the real world. I think we need to ensure that clients don't think of this as being something which is entirely outside of their control. The conditioned response that we mention in the list on the slide, well, misophonia is a learned, acquired condition, and it's something which is conditioned, and it includes a reflex. And I think probably Tom has spoken on that topic quite extensively. But it is consolidated in neural networks, the neural networks of the brain, and becomes a pattern of behaviour that for an individual seems unavoidable. But certainly I think that there are options to begin to demonstrate to the client, even before we begin with therapy, that these things are not unavoidable. So the model of misophonia is one of 5 components. I consider that it very much consists of 3 elements, which are the sensory start to the process. There's a physical reflex, or the reflex action, and there's an emotional response. And that emotional response is one that varies. It can be rage, anger, it can be shame, it can be guilt. There are so many emotions. And the other 2 components that we need to look at are these, they are the linkages. And these I believe to be the neural patterns that are created as the condition is learned. So, what is sequent repatterning? It brings together several established therapeutic techniques, and it allows for a journey, a sequence of interventions. Now, we know that misophonia doesn't enjoy enduring benefit through hypnotic suggestion for some time now. Hypnosis has been used in a traditional suggestive way, and evidence of therapy does demonstrate the benefits, although they can seem to be quite marvellous in the short term, are transitory and are probably not consolidated as learned within the neurology of the individual. But employing hypnosis as a platform for therapy has a number of benefits. It provides an enhanced environment for psychological intervention and for neurological change. We bring in timeline aspects. We include parts work, ego states by any other name, and we use NLP, neuro-linguistic programming techniques, which include physical anchoring. We also sometimes use the swish technique. Now, a few moments ago, Tom mentioned using progressive muscle relaxation, what I sometimes refer to as being differential muscle relaxation, where the individual begins to learn the difference between relaxation and tension. And that, alongside physical anchoring, can bring about a state of calm, steady thought when anxiety has been the feeling up until that point. So this is something which is very important and is quite obviously part of the ongoing self-maintenance of any individual who is looking to reduce the effect of misophonia. So the underlying concept of sequent repatterning is perhaps that which is increasingly becoming known as neuropsychotherapy, or NPT. So this is the therapeutic framework. It begins on the left-hand side as you're looking at it and ends across on the right-hand side, and there are 5 broad areas of intervention as are shown on this slide. Now, misophonia usually shares an initial reflex across all these stimulus experiences. That is, some kind of physical jerk, the shrugging of the shoulders perhaps, or whatever it may be, but that will be the same whether the observed event is a cough heard or a swinging foot that's seen in the peripheral vision. So we begin at that end of the process usually, just allowing us to begin to achieve on a wider basis than we would do if we were working with each individual stimulus, or in the classical terminology, with each individual trigger. Now, I won't here go into the theoretical or the procedural detail of these steps, but I think it's probably important to notice that we begin by establishing a foundation for change, and as it says on the on the slide here, a firm and reliable foundation. We need to do a detailed assessment. Very often our clients arrive and they are very obviously self-diagnosed. Now, many of the clients that come to me for sequent repatterning have in fact seen Tom at the Misophonia Treatment Institute prior to contacting me. So very often they have been assessed to a certain extent, and they have completed some kind of patient fact-finding documents. And amongst those, probably the key documents that we use are the MAQ2, the Misophonia Assessment Questionnaire, the second revision of that, and the A-MISO-S, which is the Amsterdam Misophonia Scale. We also endeavour to put together an inventory of the experiences that make them feel uncomfortable. That's called the trigger inventory. And we look at the physical and emotional severity of each of those and its source, both in terms of place or person. From there, we move on to introducing guided relaxation. Now, as I say, some of these clients will have experience with TOM and will have been introduced to progressive muscle relaxation. But we endeavour to go beyond simple physical relaxation here and begin to open the mind, if you like, to give the client an awareness of their inner world. And I do have a information sheet which I tend to give to the clients, which explains to them that their inner world is something that everyone shares and which is equally as important as the physical world around them. From there we move into the foundation and commitment, and the commitment also is essential here because the person being treated needs to know that they are responsible for their progress and that their therapist is there to guide them and not to do the work for them. We move on to a stage of emotional healing, as it's called here, which is really to identify the emotions that were associated with the initial condition, how they felt when they began to respond in an uncomfortable way to certain sounds, certain other experiences. It's quite important here for them to realise that they're not being in any way regressed, they're not being asked to revivify those experiences, but simply to reactivate those memories, because what we're looking to do is to bring those memories into a labile state later in the process. So around about this time that we also introduce physical anchors and give the client an opportunity to practice those in their own time. So these are self-guided activities. We'll then usually begin by doing some parts work on the ego states and looking at those behaviours and behaviour patterns that the individual has, and then we begin to look at reframing the reflex, and that's very much a context reframe that we do then. We can then move on and make some decisions there. Sometimes we do use the NLP swish technique, which is usually described as having a vision or a visualization of a better future, but also we'll do some anchoring of the positive resources that we're able to elicit. From there we move on to experiential reframing, and in this area I use a great deal of auditory hallucination, which seems to be especially effective because for those clients with sound sensitivities, we can ask them to hallucinate some of those sounds and to manipulate them both in terms of loudness, comfort levels, all kinds of parameters. We'll also look at some of the other contacts, and this is a fairly old slide, so it uses the T word, I'm afraid, in a number of areas, but we do look at those initiating responses. Usually by this time we've begun to see an improvement in the person's overall well-being, and also an improvement in how uncomfortable they become when they are exposed to an individual experienced. That allows us then to begin to put together a plan for the future and to look and see their future self as somebody who is benefiting from the changes that have been achieved. So, what are those outcomes? It is very definitely not the case that every individual completes their own personal process within 8 sessions. Many of those that we see have other issues. Often there are multiple conditions that we're looking at, and as Randy mentioned earlier, there are those with conditions like OCD that we must take into account. Also, a significant proportion of the younger people that have worked with me have been somewhere on the autism spectrum as well. So we must balance how we provide interventions with need and with their actual progress, as well as other comorbidities. But the plan is to work to a program of 8 sessions and then to review at 8 or 10 weeks where we are. It is not a long-term therapy. So all that said, 2015 saw more individuals experiencing this therapy than previously, and that was made possible by having Mags Booth, Tara Economarkis and Desiree Verglers all commencing work with misophonia clients during that year. During 2015, I began and concluded sequences with 72 clients. That was working with individuals in the age range of 8 years old to a little over 70 years old. I'm not a specialist in working with children, and generally speaking, I prefer to work with individuals who are over 10 years old, but we did have some success with younger children. Now, only a few of these were face-to-face consultations in my therapy rooms. Generally, we consulted using the telemedicine platform VC, and that provides an uncomplicated and reliable connection, which in very many ways is far superior to Skype. But it really does seem that working remotely, online that is just as effective as being together in the same place and up close. Working online, we do need to ensure that the client's environment is appropriate, and those who maintain standards do best, it seems. So having comfortable, supportive seating, that's important. Good lighting, that's not too bright, but light enough for us to see what's going on. Using headphones or earbuds is very important. All those kinds of things that we would expect to have a reasonable quality call. But we also know, again from experience, that we benefit from frequent and regular sessions. And generally speaking, these are weekly. We try not to miss sessions. Certainly no more frequently than 5 days, and hopefully no less frequently than 10. But missed appointments and interruptions do genuinely ruin progress. So let's just move on and look at the achievements of those 72 individuals. Now, our intake process, as I think I mentioned a few moments ago, includes the consultation prior to commencement of therapy. And that's probably around about 45 minutes to an hour in length. And that may be, and usually is, I think, additional to some evaluation time with Tom, if they're, in many cases, referred through the Misophonia Treatment Institute. We also collect personal factual information together with standardised information gathering on the misophonia condition. And as I mentioned earlier, that very definitely includes A-Meso-S and MAQ-2. Now, I used MAQ-2 as a measure of severity and of progress during the therapeutic process. And I've been reluctant to modify it to create an MAQ-3, if you like, because I think it will change its status as a standard. But perhaps that's a discussion for another time. I'd be interested to hear if there are any thoughts about that. But here on this slide, we see the MAQ scores immediately before we began therapy. That's before there's been any relaxation or any work at all. And the MAQ scores are grouped into buckets of 10. And as those of you who know the MAQ, the questionnaire runs from a score of 0 to a maximum of 63. And I think it's generally reckoned that the range from 31 represents severe, with those above 40 being really very severe. Between 11 and 20 is borderline, and certainly below 10 is subclinical by anybody's estimation. Now we can see the shift between the MAQ scores at intake and the scores at the conclusion of the structured program, which is usually planned for week 8. So this is those individuals as recorded at week 0, and this is their MAQ scores 2 months later. Now, as you can see, the distribution probably looks as though it has been mirrored. For the vast majority of individual clients, those values have fallen down into the subclinical or the non-severe areas. But rather than dwelling on these individual MAQ scores, let's just look at those scores when they've been normalised. So what we did was to normalise the MAQ scores to 100 at intake, and then to look at the percentage improvement over therapy. Now, as you'll see on the left-hand side, the green semi-transparent arrow pointing down towards 0, which is effectively 0 response on the MAQ and 0%. Let's just remove that now. But what we do see is that 2 individuals from this 72 actually reached an MAQ score of 0. Now that was one who had sequent repatterning alone, and one who'd had sequent repatterning that sufficiently reduced his emotional response to allow him to do some additional work on the physical reflex, and his MAQ reached 0. But we have a normalised MAQ here, normalised at 100% immediately before we commence the first therapy session, and then at the conclusion of the therapy sequence. I think this does better reflect the change per individual, although of course those beginning with a fairly low MAQ score have a consequently lower percentage change. But what we do see here is that at the 50 to 60% improvement, we have a large part of that population. Now, if we then move on to around about 6 months later, now please do be aware that this is a follow-up in a clinical setting. It's not a research or a trial, so we're really relying on the kind collaboration of individuals, and not all of them provided feedback at this stage. So the number of respondents here is slightly down on the previous slide. But what we do see quite clearly, that those recorded show that around about 75% of respondents still having a 50% or more reduction in their severity. That's in fact 44 out of 57. And that 35% of those responding after 6 months still had a 70% or better response to the therapy. And for those with a 70% improvement in their symptoms, for many of those it really has been life-changing. So I think it seems that we are justified in promoting this as an effective therapy. And we do also just need, I think, to take into account here all of the data that I've shown you shows that not a single individual had an increase in MAQ at any time following commencement of therapy, and that's in any case. So I think that's probably something which we ought to also congratulate ourselves upon, that we didn't have any that got worse while we were treating them. So maybe now just to have a look towards the future. And I think our future is centred very much around training. And ideally we must begin to expand our therapy provision, and we plan to train more therapists to effectively provide sequent repatterning. So having a wider clinical presence will also allow for further, and I hope wider, research and potential development. And it's also likely to bring a still more eclectic mix of therapists into the sequent repatterning area. Our plans now include training a cohort of experienced and qualified therapists. And to do that, as I did in 2015, when we were working face to face, but we can quite obviously work online, especially now that Tom has brought WizIQ into our focus. Training might, as I mentioned, be physical or virtual, and I think it might include training groups, larger groups as well as small, as well as one-to-one training. And we look at the kinds of training candidates that are suitable in a few moments, but just for now saying suitable, qualified and experienced therapists. And I would hope also those with an active practice. Now I noticed that working with those for whom English isn't a first language, that influenced our progress, and my own attempts at integrating German into therapy created a lot of moments of hilarity, but I don't think they did very much to promote therapeutic excellence. But I was fortunate enough to be able to train Dozier Verglers last year, and she's from the Netherlands. She's a native Dutch speaker with faultless German, and although she's been unwell over these past few months, I'm hoping that she'll be able to return to practice fairly soon. And it's clear that working in a native tongue is not simply a benefit, but in most cases it is essential. So extending sequent repatterning into Spanish, French, German, Chinese variants and others must really now be a priority for us all. So, who is it that might be suitable for training? Now, I mentioned earlier, I think that adopting these techniques, the sequence of repatterning interventions, should be for practicing therapists. That's individuals working with clients or patients in an effective way already. And with, first of all, skills and abilities, but also formal or qualified training under their belt in specific therapeutic techniques, and that includes hypnosis, yes, qualified, I'd say to hypnotherapy diploma or practitioner diploma level in the UK, and accepted for registration here by the CNHC, the Government Created Professional Standards Authority. And in the USA, I think that is broadly equivalent to a board certified hypnotist practitioner. In NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, perhaps a diploma validated by one of the recognised bodies, like DIP NLP. Timeline work and parts therapy are possibly less well defined or regulated, but certainly recognised courses accredited by the Guild of Hypnotists in the USA, the GHR or NCH in the UK, or by the National Council for Physiotherapists or the British Psychological Society. For those in the UK, perhaps from a psychology background rather than from a hypnotherapy background. But, and importantly, the candidate for training should be somebody with a busy and dynamic practice and day-to-day client contact. This isn't something that can be read from a book. It needs to be intuitively delivered. And an interview, I guess, or a discussion with each potential training delegate may well clarify their suitability before we sign them up. So what else in the future? I think as my time is coming to a close, I very much like to see a formal register of therapists who are using and able to use sequent repatterning as a therapy, and this is something that Tom has begun to do through the Misophonia Institute. I think that we need close ties to the Misophonia Treatment Institute and to the Misophonia Institute itself. I think there should be a community of therapists, and not just sequent repatterning therapists, but very certainly a group like this collaboration group where we can get together, we can exchange ideas, and we can learn from one another. So there should be a community of therapists. And again, in all areas, a continual development, I think, would be very useful. But quite obviously, in sequent repatterning, I am looking to continue to develop the techniques that we're using. So that brings me to the empty slide and then to the thank you. You can find out more about sequent repatterning. You can contact me. There's a contact form on my website, www.chrispearson.co.uk. There's also a contact form at www.sequentrepatterning.com. And that concludes my rather whistle-stop tour through sequent repatterning. And I just heard Tom return to the host seat. I'll hand it back to you. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Chris. Questions, everyone? What questions, comment, discussion? What do you have for Chris? So I see Esther is typing. Can you say more about the reflexive part, Chris?
What brought Tom and I into contact, I think, was the recognition that there is a physical reflex involved in misophonia. I would say in all cases, but I'll moderate that to say most. I was very early on confronted with a client who came to see me who reacted very badly to the sound of whispering. And when she was exposed to whispering, she would the muscular response straightened all of her fingers and thumbs, and she'd drop anything that she was holding. And I found that quite astonishing. I investigated it, and that was what began to lead me to believe that the physical reflex in misophonia is an important step in the process. And I also quite firmly believe that if that physical reflex can be removed or it can be subdued, that it actually reduces the emotional response that comes after it.
Okay, so let me show something here. So Chris, do you see a video screen on your window now of a girl of a foot?
I see a media player, but I don't see a picture.
Okay, so this is I believe a 9-year-old girl who I videoed the physical reflex of.
An 8-year-old girl with misophonia, and it's a demonstration of the reflex that she had on October 21st. And you'll notice that her shoulder jerks and that her foot jerks when she hears the sniffing sound.
Do you hear that? See that?
I can hear the audio, but I can't see the
Misophonia,
video.
and this is a demonstration of the
So then
reflex
we
she
have to-
had
how on earth
on
do I-
October the 21st.
Okay, so
And you'll
this
notice
is
that her shoulder jerks
frustrating for me
and that
that
her
I've
foot jerks when
not
she
been able
hears the
to show this.
It's asking for a YouTube URL.
with misophonia, and this is a demonstration
Well,
of the reflex
I
she
actually
had on
have given it the YouTube URL and thought that this would in fact show it to everyone, but clearly you're not seeing it.
I'm not, although Michael has said he is seeing it.
So Esther said she can see the video. Okay, so I have to clear my throat here, and I'm going to mute my microphone. I thought I had it muted right when I cut it back on before, and I cleared my throat. So to those with misophonia who watch this later, I apologize. But this is going to have a strong sniff in it. I'm going to play it again. And so the first part will show her shoulder and her whole upper body jerk. And this is
a demonstration of the reflex that she had
watch
on
this. So
October.
So did you see that jerk, that her whole upper body kind of jerks, and I could see her arm jerk. And I thought that's where her reflex was. But upon working with her more, I noticed that her reflex was actually in her leg.
With misophonia,
And so we're going to see now
of the reflex
what it
she
shoots
had
to
on
shows us the image of
October
her leg.
21st. And you'll notice that her shoulder jerks and that her foot jerks when she hears the sniffing sound.
And notice how the toes open up and the feet kind of kick out. And when we worked on this a little bit last year, she reported that she feels it in her calves. So obviously that's where her real initial reflex is.
With
Here it goes
misophonia,
again.
This is an 8-year-old girl with misophonia, and this is a demonstration of the reflex that she had.
Well, I don't know why that just cut
October.
back, because it's supposed to be. Here it goes.
Relaxed.
And so there was a physical jerk of that muscle in her legs, and it looks like that reflex is a conditioned physical reflex response to the trigger stimulus. And I've seen that in a number of individuals, in almost all individuals. Esther, I worked with one woman on a intermittent basis, fairly continual, steady at first, and she could not identify her physical reflex. We didn't know that she had one. 6 months into working together, she declared one day, "I know what my physical reflex is." And she told me that when she was at work that week, one of her coworkers said, "Why are you angry?" And she says, "I'm not angry." And the lady said, "Then why are you frowning?" She said, "And in fact, you frown almost all the time." And she realized that her physical response was a frown. And so she actually found that when she's triggered, if she rubs up in her eyebrows, in this area, that it really helps to reduce the stress and the agony of her misophonia, because it's pinching. She's essentially getting a bee sting in her forehead. So that's the video, or that's the initial reflex. Does that answer your question, Esther?
Could you, Tom, paste the YouTube URL into the chat box, and then we can see what that is? And for those of us that couldn't see it, maybe we can watch it on YouTube later.
Okay, that would be a very doable thing. So here it is. There's the URL.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, somebody, it worked for somebody. There was a hand that went up. Esther, let's see if we can give you the microphone. You have to accept it, Esther. There's something on your end, a box that's going to come up and say, "Please, will you allow WizIQ to control your computer," or something like that. We had trouble with this a couple of months ago, with an individual not being able to find the right controls on your end. So Esther, I apologize. I don't know where they are. Oh, she's got it. Esther, welcome. Perfectly.
Oh, okay. So does this reflex occur when there's the initial stimulus, or does it continue? Does it come and go?
My interpretation of it is that it is an instant and a response to the sensory experience. So it is, to all intents and purposes, the very first conscious awareness that the person has of their response.
It actually, I agree with Chris, it makes an auditory sound a physical sensation. And
oh, that's a multi-sensory.
Well,
I'd say it makes the sensory experience into a physical movement, but Tom is...
No, I like that. That's exactly, Chris, that's exactly what I was trying to say. Is that when my autonomic nervous system hears a trigger, a physical motion is a muscle reflex is elicited in my body. So I feel it as a jerk to my body. Essentially, it's kind of, like getting shocked by static electricity. And it can actually be very, very strong in some individuals, and it can be very weak in others. But it seems that physical sensation is always there.
And then when you do progressive muscle relaxation, do you try to differentially target?
Yes, absolutely. Especially if it is an area that is easily affected. Shoulders, fist clench, jaw clench. There are some areas that muscle relaxation cannot help us with this initial reflex. For example, a stomach constriction or an intestinal constriction, sexual response. Those are I have cases of those also, but the muscle relaxation wouldn't work for that. But if a person can relax, if suppose a person that had the fist clench open, hands go open, that if that person can work at relaxing those muscles, then it can have a large impact in the severity of their misophonia.
I'd also add here, Tom, that although quite obviously there are areas which we cannot involve in therapeutic work, for instance, the stomach, we can use hypnotic techniques to manipulate the muscles in the stomach wall, and I do for those with a stomach response. Some of the other smooth muscle in the intestines that we can begin to influence, although we can do it, they can't actually feel that, and if they can't feel it, it's probably not a worthwhile exercise. But there are internal muscles that can be manipulated through hypnotic techniques.
Which is fantastic, because progressive muscle relaxation cannot, right? But
the benefit there, of course, is that once the individual has learned that is possible, they can allow that to happen. They can incorporate that into their routine. But that's a small point. Sorry, Esther, I think I interrupted you.
Oh, well, maybe I interrupted you, but so I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist, and I'm not sure if this would in any way parallel tics, but what you sometimes try to do is help the person identify a key sensation to the tic, and then if they can, when they notice that, do the opposite of that sensation or movement, that's a bit helpful. But I don't know if the reflex reaction is really quite the same as a tic.
You're volume's a little bit low, Esther. I think you were saying that sometimes you help people identify a sensation that they're having and then try to come up with an opposite one. Was that correct?
Yes, when working with tics.
Okay. Okay.
I'm not sure if this reflex may be a different thing than a tic, but when you were describing that, it reminded me a little bit of that, doing an opposite reaction to the sensation that comes just before the tic. But I don't know if that would apply to a reflex.
I think it is very, very similar, Esther, in some ways. I've looked at some of the work that's been done by Linda Hudson on tics, using hypnosis. I don't know whether you're familiar with that. And I find a lot of parallels there. I guess the way I'm looking at this is to use the kind of triune brain model rather than a physical mapping. And most of that processing which occurs in the premammalian parts of the brain, that physical reflex occurs at the moment that the message moves into the neocortex, into the conscious awareness.
Like very fast.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things that I believe, one reason that with misophonia, exposure, traditional, well, maybe not exposure, but not graduated exposure or desensitization, but just exposure to the triggers tends to make it stronger, makes misophonia worse, and probably the reflex stronger. That with a phobia, you have a physiological response that comes up and up and up, and if you're continue being exposed to that picture of the spider, then that sensation starts to come, physiological response comes down. Where with misophonia, you hear the sniff and it's this instant response. It's an instant physical jerk. And it's not about allowing it to come down over time, because classical conditioning occurs between a stimulus and a response within muscular, within a half to 0 to maybe maximum of 2 seconds. And so it's an instant conditioning effect experience where I get let's say a 50% jerk in the muscle because of the trigger sound, and then I get another 25% adder on that because I'm upset. And so I'm creating really a classical conditioning event that strengthens this physical reflex. The other thing I want to mention before we're out of time real quick is the emotional response. Bender Kumar gave a presentation at the Misophonia conference, and we hope to have him on this once he's published the article, but where the emotional response appears to also be a conditioned response, a conditioned emotional response. So we're dealing with two levels of conditioned responses. One is the physical one and one is the emotional one. Comments, thoughts?
Well, it's just, those are conditioned response to the stimulus and or to sensitivity. Like, where does the hypersensitivity, or is that not quite a correct concept?
I believe that the hypersensitivity, I thought, or the sibling who thumps their brother in the ear every time they pass. One thump is one thing, but when they do it day in, day out, the emotional buildup can become extreme. Did I answer your question?
I think so. I have to think about it, but I understand what.
Because there's lots of pairing. See, if let's look at fingernails on a chalkboard. Fingernails on a chalkboard. I hear the screech. I shiver. I have a physical response, and I go, "Stop that! I hate that!" And so the sensation is uncomfortable. It's irritating. It's intrusive, and there are many, many pairings of the, irritating, anger, disgust, whatever the emotions are, with that sound and with that sensation. So the emotional response comes to a point that they've had so many pairings of this sensation and this irritation that now the irritation becomes an irritation reflex, a conditioned emotional response.
Yeah, I see how if you're talking about conditioned reflex, that seems like an opposite kind of process in exposure conceptualization.
Say that again a little bit louder. I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, I think I have to think about it more, but I can see if it's a conditioned response. The more you do it, the stronger it gets, as opposed to the concept of exposure, where the more you do it, the weaker it gets.
Right, and that is, and at least in the natural environment, that is what we see, is that the more they're exposed to trigger stimuli, the worse their misophonia becomes. Okay, well, let me run over here real quickly for those of us who are still here. Chris, thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to say both thank to Randy and Chris. And here's the future workshops. I'm not going to cover those now. That's in the PowerPoint. But let's see, I'm hitting more thank yous. Stop the recording because now I'm going to